The events in Curacao had left a lingering bitterness in much of the crew. If there ever had been a needless, ill-advised plan from the Admiralty, the men felt, Curacao had been it. 18 of your crew killed, 43 wounded. And everyone had felt that had the HMS Vanguard arrived in time and been available, the outcome may have been different. But it didn't. And the outcome wasn't. Lieutenant Perrault had taken a cannonball to his arm during the landing, but during the last week in Curacao, the wound had begun to fester, and his arm was amputated. You had learned during the voyage back to Port Royal that before the landing, Lieutenant Perrault had just swapped seats with Lieutenant Hills before the cannonball came whistling through. The crew used black humor to deal with the situation. Whenever Lieutenant Perrault took a seat, the other officers would ask if he'd like to exchange positions. Even the act of doing his private business at the head of the ship was not exempt from this humor. The only real advantage to come out of the failed siege at Curacao was that the ship's food was looked upon as favorable to the miserable fare eaten during the time on the island. The other welcome relief was the weather. The island's interior had been unmercifully hot and humid. Here at sea, the weather had been sunny, but with a constant breeze which made working in the heights mostly pleasurable. After weeks there and then at sea, the sight of Port Royal on the horizon was a welcome one. There was much work to be done fixing the riggings and sails, but this meant there was also time for some leisure after hours, time you could use to get away from the crew. You were almost 18, and while you had many casual friends on board, they were individuals you spent literally months with and in close confined quarters. You thus needed the precious time on your own. One of your favorite leisure activities was listening to the merchant sailors' tales of places you'd not yet been. In Port Royal there was a saying that there are 2 taverns to every home. While you hadn't done any formal counts, you suspected that this was not an exaggeration. Taverns were everywhere. Your favorite was one such small hovel that went by the name of the Ale Storm, which many in the Navy considered unsavory, but it was filled with the type of merchant sailors you'd have grown accustomed to as a boy. As a result, it was also the place least likely to find fellow Navy seamen, and thus you could afford yourself some peace and quiet. The outfitting was completed at the end of August, and the ship's new orders were to patrol near San Domingo to enforce a blockade against the French alongside the HMS Thesis. The very same HMS Thesis that had fought at the Battle of the Nile under the command of Captain Ralph Willett Miller. During that battle, the Royal Navy fleet was outnumbered in terms of firepower, up against a French flagship, a 118-gun monster called the L'Orient. However, the Royal Navy prevailed under the overall command of Admiral Nelson. It was a calm, sunny day when at the end of August, your ship finally left Port Royal. The Hercule herself looking in the best shape you'd seen her in since you joined. Your one thought after inspecting the heights thoroughly was that she could weather any storm thrown at her. How fateful that last thought would turn out to be. All was peaceably routine during your voyage to San Domingo, whose vicinity you reached on the afternoon of the 2nd of September. The objective, to prevent French ships from reaching the port city, which had been in French hands these last 2 years since 1802. On the evening of the 3rd, far from the land, the rain began to increase in intensity, as did the winds. By the early morning hours on the 4th, the waves got higher, and the ship began to toss more violently than any storm or cannon fire barrage you'd experienced. You worked as trained with the others to ensure all cargo lashings were tight, all hatches battened down, and entry port covers fitted. The storm, rising, swept one sailor clear off the deck, but you had not time to identify who it was, even as he screamed for some seconds once overboard. There was no way to rescue him, and most men could not swim, although swimming would have done him no good. The HMS Thesis was in the vicinity, but left to her own crew to decide her fate, and you to yours. swaying violently and heaving so hard that it was nigh impossible to remain standing or seated. The wind began to blow even fiercer, the ship riding the waves like a bucking horse, dishes and cargo thrown from one side of the ship to the other. There was not a man on board the ship who escaped the violence. All were bruised, as if trampled underfoot by an unrelenting herd of horses. A step forward could heave you sideways into whatever blocked the way, and if there was nothing there, you were simply thrown. You had to be extra careful, as the ceiling height was low to begin with, and now head wounds were a real danger. Water rushed over the decks of the ship with each gale that lashed across the Hercule's decks. Morning gave no reprieve from the storm, the sky still blackened as if locked in perpetual night. The storm was battering the ship so violently now that men grabbed what posts they could, many of them praying and confessing sins. You were assigned as part of a group manning the bilge pumps, the rest bailing manually below. While some of the newest ships had new suction pump-style systems, the Hercule relied on the more antiquated chain pumps. A continuous chain with small burrs that acted like buckets catching water and were then raised and lowered in continuous cycles. The timber creaked all around you as you struggled to assist the chains. Not helping matters was the men, either through laziness or just plain debauchery, would often use those bilges as a latrine. That accumulation of filth and garbage now overflowed onto you and everywhere in your surroundings. Already nauseous from the unyielding storm, you now began to vomit profusely. Mercifully, there wasn't much food in your belly to purge, and what little there was, you let out to the side, still hanging onto the chains, now covered in not just others' filth, but your own. During moments of high stress like this, time dilates into almost nothingness. Each second a long hour, and each hour a long day. The men passed what food there was around to eat, but you were decidedly not hungry, even after switching off, as there was no opportunity to clean yourself. You were unable to do much of anything above the deck due to the dangerous conditions, but were to keep an eye above deck from the safety of the latch. The ship, now heaving, surfed the waves and then was hogged and sagged at all ends before finally being popped out on the other side of the wave. The water then lashed across the deck. The worst was when the ship on the forward slope of such a wave would then get violently slewed round broadside to the waves, which would then break aboard, almost heeling her over and capsizing the Hercule. Each such movement brought the timber creaks and strains to their utmost limit, and soon some above deck began to crack under this stress. This dragged on for 5 long days and nights, and soon much of the timber on deck had taken some form of damage. Men soiled and dirty mostly slept standing, drifting in and out of consciousness, as any who tried to bed in their hammocks were colliding violently into one another, swaying as hard as a man spinning a sack with his free hands. Sleep could simply not be had but in spurts. Food could still not be cooked, and was eaten when and if possible simply to sustain, as no one had appetite. Men who were already bruised were after these 5 days and nights slashed across legs, arms, and face. Finally, on the 6th day, the storm subsided, leaving the crew to clean up the mess above and below deck. And themselves. After 5 days in the squalid conditions below deck, you were mighty glad to be in the fresh air. The damage the Hercule sustained on the decks was immense. Broken timber, wedged and strewn everywhere the winds couldn't blow it clear off the ship. The lines had all been cut in time, but the sails, they were in tatters. The ship looked as bad as it had during the battle with the French frigate, if not worse. The HMS Thesis had not fared much better. The ship's surgeons on both ships were tending to an unending line of injured seamen. Thankfully, other than bruises and hands aching from the bilge chain work, you were okay. Hungry, but okay, as appetites and proper meals slowly returned, and the Hercule would limp back to Port Royal under the barest of sails. Once there, After many more days at sea than the voyage would normally have taken, the ship was put in for inspections. These were standard when ships suffered as much damage as the Hercule did. There was talk the Hercule, which had started its life as a French-built ship, might not sail again. And while the crew waited, some were reassigned, which did not bode well. You made your way to the Aylestorn Tavern on one evening, taking your usual seat somewhere along the establishment's west wall where the old sea dogs would spin their tails. You could see the back of one of them getting the attention of a group of others who'd milled around him with their chairs to get in better earshot. You were intrigued and moved closer with your own chair. Then suddenly, you froze, the chair still dangling from your right arm. The voice, it was familiar, but it couldn't be. You moved to get a better look at the face, but did so in a way so as not to allow him to see you unless turning his head unnaturally. Your heart thumped loudly with a combination of fear, loathing, anger, but mostly shock. It was McGee. But this was impossible. McGee had died with your old captain when the ship went down. Or so you'd been told. Because here he was. There was no mistaking it. You had entered into a neutral state with McGee during that final voyage, but that was likely due to the size you'd been putting on. Always there was the anger of how he had treated you with such abhorrent malice and contempt. It was there, simmering just below the surface whenever you thought of the otherwise adventurous past on the Cordelia. If McGee had survived, what of the captain? You were determined to find out, but you needed the element of surprise. The other thing you noticed, and it stood out, was the manner in which McGee was dressed. He was well outside his usual class, dressing more like a rich gentleman than the old sea dog he was. Even on land, you'd never seen him dressed like this. You moved back to your old spot and decided to keep a safe but distant eye on him. He continued to spin tales and drink as the evening wore on. You were never much of a drinker, usually having but a pint or two, but on this night, you abstained completely. You would confront McGee, and you wanted all your wits about you when doing so. You were on duty the next day, but you did not care. You would find out what was going on. Finally, 2 hours after the mid of night, he got up and you quickly angled in the other direction. As he left with a slight stumble, you followed him. He stumbled a few streets to an inn that catered to sailors, but not of the common type. This was a place only captains and their associates on merchant ships could afford. He unlocked an exterior door to a room on the first floor of the building's east side. Your anger simmering, you accelerated your pace and hurled yourself at him as he stood in the now open doorway about to walk in. You were no longer the small boy he would beat on indiscriminately. You were now a full head taller than McGee, with sinewy, albeit still bruised muscles all over your body. You both came crashing down upon a table situated at the foot of his bed. You were the first up, and immediately you leaped upon McGee, still shaking his head, dazed. Now upon his chest you grabbed both of your hands and choked McGee, demanding him to tell you where the captain was. His eyes enlarged in recognition as he met your gaze, but he stayed silent, so you squeezed harder. Then a flash of pain on your left side. Leaving your right hand on his throat, you instinctively grabbed at your side with the left, where McGee had sunk in a sailor's knife. Half your hand was on his, the other half on the blade as you struggled to keep him from digging the knife deeper. He may have been old, but he still had the strength of an old sailor. You released the hold on his throat and punched him as hard as you could on the side of his head, which finally caused him to release the knife. Now bleeding, you quickly grabbed the blade even as he struggled to reclaim it. You now held it at his throat. "Speak, damn it!" you yelled at him. But still, he said nothing. You kept the knife in place, but quickly averted your eyes to get a sense of your surroundings. It was then you spied it. A small chest, but instantly recognizable as the type a captain keeps, locked with his funds and most precious belongings, just under the corner of McGee's bed. Rage took over. You hurled the knife to the far corner of the room and began to swing your fists in blind rage, each fist landing repayment for your suffering at his hands. You don't remember how long you swung in fury at McGee, only that eventually you stopped, realizing that you should not be the final arbiter of his justice. With his face bloody and swelling, you stopped. He was unconscious, and you were still bleeding from your side. You tore a strip off of one of his sheets on the bed and rolled McGee onto his stomach, then tied his hands behind his back and used the rest to bind yourself around your waist to stem the bleeding. Finding the nearest night guard, you received assistance in bringing McGee and his likely ill-gotten gains to the Royal Marine Station on the other side of the port. McGee was held, and the ship's owners back in England were notified by mail. It turned out the funds minus what McGee had spent had been the captain's, which had been presumed long lost along with the ship and crew when the letters came back in response 2 months later. He had fled to the West Indies and Port Royal, and as fate would have it, into your company. The Navy and its merchant branch took such theft seriously. He was found guilty of not only the theft, but murder, as there was no alibi for not reporting this incident and being the lone survivor. And he continued to say nothing. There was only one punishment for such a transgression, and that was hanging. Whatever had happened on that ship could only be guessed at, as McGee would take the true events with him to his grave. Any satisfaction you had beating and apprehending him paled in comparison when you thought of the fate of your old captain and his new crew. 3 months had passed. McGee would be hanged, and word came back that the repairs would be too costly. The ship would remain in dock until such time as she was reclaimed and then scuttled. You had not yet heard word of your fate, and had in the interim worked repairing other ships of the fleet docked at the port. What adventures would await you next? And that ends this episode. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, and if you haven't already but enjoy the content, please consider subscribing. I'd love to have you on board. Till the next video, cheers.